Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Amusing Panda live stream, your musing and amusing source for all things Warmachine. This week, we are joined once again by Mr. Brandon Owens to have a bit of I guess it's sort of differentiating the borderline between a journeyman game and a master's game. So we're talking all about puzzles and the growth frontier and what separates the good from the great.
Alex, I thought that Finns were known for their patience, but it would appear that I was wrong.
Oh
This,
man.
this man wanted me to show up with puzzles in my hand like too many limes the second the show started. I'm so sorry.
Mhm. I was thinking about doing some sort of Warmachine AI generated thumbnail for this, but I know people get up your ass for AI gen art, so we're just going with the old fashioned panda for now. Yeah, so I guess before we get to that, we got a new release to discuss. Probably one of the strangest casters that's ever come out. We have Nimara the Shadow Blade. Brandon, what's your first blush here?
So, when I initially looked at Namara, I did not think she was going to be all that great. She has a lot of rules, and many, if not most of the rules, are not like cast this spell or use this ability, get obvious effect. It's like you can spend hunger for this ability to gain this other esoteric ability name, which now gives you this like extra novel benefit that you also have to read several times to understand. So she's a lot to take in when you're just reading her card as opposed to putting her on the table. But I've played a few games with her on the table now, and I think she's actually quite good. I'm very impressed with Namara, and a lot of the doubts that I had about her kit sort of went away when I started playing her. The stuff that you want to do with her abilities works the way that it should, as opposed to being clunky or challenging like I thought that some of them might be. So
Hmm.
I think she's a really good warlock, and I think we're going to see a lot of her.
Where were you expecting Clunk, and where did she sort of deliver a smooth user experience?
So part of it is in her hunger economy, which is one thing you look at when you're evaluating any Fane Warlock at this point, is what is their hunger economy going to look like in terms of how reliably are they generating hunger and how much demand is there on their hunger and how capable will they be of spending hunger in the way that they want. And when you
Hmm.
look at Namara's hunger economy, just looking at her card, it seems like it'll be difficult because a lot of it is that your opponent has to kill war beasts in order for you to get hunger. So some of the agency is taken out of your hands, and that you can shove a war beast down your opponent's throat and say, please kill this thing. I've got 5 fury on it, or whatever number, 3 fury on it. But they always have the option to not kill it if they have some other path forward that they can take. So it seems
Hmm.
like there might be some friction there in terms of her wanting to get enough hunger. And then the other thing is most of her spenders are very expensive. So On
Right.
Dark Wings is only 3. That's not super expensive by itself. And it provides a very good benefit. But then like We Descend, which is her accuracy bonus, costs 5, which is very expensive for hunger. And then her Crack the Sky ability on her shield, Daybreaker, also costs 5, very expensive. But when I've played it on the table, it works out that I tend to have as much hunger as I need at any point in time. That
Hmm.
and the ability to spend hunger in place of fury for casting spells and healing was also more beneficial than I guess I realized just reviewing her card. Also,
Right.
as an aside, Daybreaker is the absolute most badass name you could possibly choose for a shield wielded by a vampire.
Well,
Just want to put that out there.
I think it's one of those abstraction things which the Steamforged guys have been very into. Like, we don't necessarily have to be strict model literalists. There is some give room there. And Daybreaker, I sort of take to be the conjunction of her entire kit rather than throwing in yet another random range one pound nine shield just to have the line total up. Especially when adding, another initial may, put her over the line with the massacre animus. I think when it comes to our hunger economy, also, there's some other things going on with this warlock that are very different from others. One of which is essentially all of her hunger spends that aren't shadow shift are offense oriented. Everything is offense, offense, offense. So, other than shadow shift itself, you're not saving it for reactive plays. You need the ace up your sleeve, but you're often counting on a lot of pieces that you would shadow shift dying. The second is that you're heavily backstopped by Strygons, particularly muzzled Strygons bringing bonded essence, and a big stack of fury that you're not overly worried about losing or putting in dangerous places. So you can rack up fury deceptively quickly, I think.
Yeah, another concern I had is that her arc stat of 5 is pretty bad for running a bunch of war beasts.
Hmm.
You can only take in a maximum of 5 every turn, and we have Fury 5 war beasts for most of our heavies, with the exception of Horkos. So it's
Hmm.
pretty like you there is no universe in which you can max out 2 war beasts or even half max out 2 heavy war beasts and be able to take all the fury back. So you are guaranteeing frenzies. And obviously I had some doubts about how effective she would be on the table, knowing that you can only ever take the fury off 1 heavy if it's maxed out per turn. And that's sort of a tempo question for the games, and it works out well enough in the few games that I've played so far where it isn't a huge concern. Like, you are going to have things frenzy, but hopefully you can have at least 1 or 2 things not frenzy as well, and be able to have more work models available for the following turn. But it's something that I'll need to see on the table more before I have any real solid conclusions about how badly Arc 5 affects their ability to run multiple heavies.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's I think there's another factor to her, which is she's a bit of a mold breaker. So sort of standard issue Vordax have emerged over time, and she's one of the first ones that really starts to challenge your beast loadout configuration. Like, are you doing the obvious 10-point Vordak, the obvious 8-point Vordak? You're paying a lot more attention to how you're keying off of your different frenzy mechanisms and how you're using it, knowing that it's going to happen as a matter of course,
Yeah, she has a lot of
rather than being an
options.
intentional play.
She has a lot of options for building her war beasts, and also a lot of options for how you want to play them, not just as your first order game plan when you sit down, but turn over turn deciding how you want to arrange and allocate your resources, who you want to activate first and how. And that she has a lot more flexibility in that regard than I also anticipated just from reading her card the first time. And again, like, just broad strokes, like stepping back big picture, this is a warlock that you need to see on the table to really understand, more so than a lot of warlocks, just given the way that her kit is structured.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I have a couple of weird rules questions that I figure you would be the expert on. One, from Lowering Skies, says place a war beast in her control area. Do you know offhand if that factors in extended control area, or does it have to come down within 9?
So I think that this needs to be asked in the rules channel to get an official answer. But
I'm surprised nobody's asked it because it's such an obvious question.
it hasn't been out for that long. But my presumption is that because there is no war beast on the table to measure control to when you are placing it, there is no extended control. Her control range is 9
Interesting.
inches until you're measuring to a model, but there's no model to measure to until you've placed it on the table.
Right.
So basically, she has an aura equal to her control stat that you can place a war beast in, and that aura is 9 inches. Once the war beast on the table, obviously, it's measuring to it. You have an 18-inch control, but that's my presumption for how that's going to work. But I think we still need an official answer. I haven't checked today or even yesterday to see if anybody's asked it yet, but that's how I imagine it will be worked out.
The second one is a bit of a tangent. Is the interaction between Lamprey and Feral. I don't know offhand how single shot weapons interact with frenzying multiple times. Do you? Are
Well,
you compelled to use the razor maw on your
you,
second frenzy and make no attack?
I don't think so. I think that this has been resolved in other situations before for other models. I'm not positive, but I think it has. And I think the rules effectively guide you that if you can't make an attack with a weapon, you have to choose a different weapon.
Interesting, interesting, interesting. Oh yeah, because that would follow the same logic as like charging a long distance frenzy and being out of range with your highest POW weapon because it's range one, but you have other ones that are range two.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Um, well, that's. I mean, I feel like Namara and needing to see it on the table to really believe it and start to add these pieces together is a great segue into our main topic. So a few weeks ago, you advanced this thesis to me that one of the deciding factors in either Warmachine greatness or really just expanding your growth frontiers is falling in love with puzzles and solving puzzles. Do you want to talk us through, sort of what your master thesis here is? Because I can only do a sort of pale imitation versus getting it from the man himself.
I don't know if I want to ascribe the word master to the thesis, but I'll talk through sort of the genesis of this thought process and what it means to me. So first of all, like most great revelations, this one occurred to me while I was sitting in an airport waiting for a plane with David Kwan. And we're sort
That
of
is a
talking.
good inspiration space.
Yeah. So we're sitting there, we're talking about the Tucson tournament we just played at and the game in general. And I'm just sort of reflecting on games that I've played, games that I've watched other people play. And I had this epiphany that most of the best players that I know at Warmachine are players who I have observed and know for a concrete fact love puzzles. Players whom, when I've watched them play, I routinely see them set up these amazing, elegant, challenging puzzles for their opponent. And players who, when you present them a puzzle, they relish in the opportunity to unravel it and solve it. I think one of the easier names to mention in this regard is Cody DeMunn.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've ever watched Cody play, last year he was one of the world's best Infernals players. This year now he's playing Grimkin. He's also played Brine Bloods and a bunch of factions. But you watch him play, and he builds these very intricate positions on the table that every single element is well thought out, is purposeful, and he's anticipated how his opponent is going to have to solve each element of the puzzle, each piece of the bastion or fortification that he set up, and he's set additional traps and challenges layered within that to stymie his opponent's ability to either stay in the game for one more turn or to accomplish the thing that they want to accomplish. Conversely, when you give Cody a puzzle, and I've done this many times in games with him, and I've watched other players do it, instead of saying, "Oh God, how do I figure this out?" he sort of gets this like delightful little grin. He's like, "Oh yes, this is spicy. Let's tackle this one," you know. And I think,
That's a very Cody thing to say.
yeah. And so it occurred to me that this is that element, this is that spark, that quality that sets apart a great player from a good or competent player, is that joy that comes from dealing in the world of puzzles and complexity, and the skill and development and ability to both create the novel and navigate the novel that comes from that enjoyment of the process. Conversely, I've seen so many players who are very technically sound, have a great amount of game knowledge, have a solid grasp of the mechanics, but don't have that innate joy or love for puzzles. And I feel like it's an element that holds them back from getting to the next level of competitive play and competitive ability. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking about this, and I was chatting about it with David. And I think that is an element that a lot of us could work on if we want to break through to that next plateau is not just reading rules, building good lists, learning how to execute them well, but fostering this love and joy of delving into the novel and creating and solving puzzles.
Right. So this is an interesting thing that's going on here. Um, because of how this is couched, it's a dispositive element, not an innate element, like something like one could say intelligence or something like that, which is one a bit of a to say it's a decisive factor is actually like a bit of a like sociologically sticky wicket to bump into. But also it's just not true. I mean, from my days of coaching people at Warmachine, I frequently said you would be better at this game if you were slightly dumber. Um, uh, but that the dispositive element is a love for puzzles, and then I think begirding that is a sort of natural curiosity or a curious disposition. Like it doesn't actually matter how smart you are, because this isn't necessarily about like being great at the game. This love of puzzles, it's about how it exposes you to novel challenges and sets your growth frontier to something constantly within reach, or that your disposition, your mindset approaching something saying, oh boy, this is a spicy one to solve, or how can I solve this, just gives you greater and greater exposure to moving through permutations and games, and you're just growing and growing and growing, versus say being particularly smart but a little bit turned off by puzzles, and you plateau real fast. So I know that was ranging a lot off the outline, but does that track?
Yeah, and I think another way to sort of approach it is it's a question of motivation. If your motivation is to win games of Warmachine, then you're going to engage in all of these behaviors that are going to help you win. You're going to learn about rules. You're going to learn how to utilize your army, to utilize its synergies, and how to position your army. But at a certain point, you're going to hit some wall, and your motivation to win games of Warmachine isn't going to carry you through to the next level of understanding. On the other hand, if your motivation is to find new and exciting complexities and novelties and puzzles in the game of Warmachine, that's going to take you to the next level by itself without ever having to worry about the goal of winning games of Warmachine. And another player that I think of who hasn't played the game for years, who sort of embodies this, is a local of mine named Mike Scher, who who
I knew you were gonna say Mike.
Right? He's one of those players who was just, I'm gonna say, naturally incredible at the game. And it always feels weird to describe somebody's naturally good at something. But I think what was really going on is that Mike was a naturally curious person who loved novelty. And his main motivation, I'm speaking for him here. I don't know what he would tell you, but from my observations, one of his main motivators in the game was finding and exploring novelty. And it was that curiosity and creativity and the love of novelty and puzzles that sort of propelled him to greatness in the game in terms of his player ability. And a player like that, it may seem like their skill is effortless, right? Because they're not necessarily doing all of this research and all of this practice and memorizing things, and yet somehow they're so incredibly good at the game. And that's because they are playing for a love of the novel and a love of the puzzles, and that just sort of naturally propels you to learn all of the other things and break through a lot of the walls that players otherwise meet when they're trying to improve their game.
Right. I love. There's so many branching off points here. The Italians have a word sprezzatura, which is usually translated as effortless elegance. But it actually also implies studied work at effortless elegance. That you have deliberately cultivated the art of making things look easy. Um, you know, it's also interesting that you mentioned the motive, like other intrinsic motivations. You know, I think in a lot of discussions this would be casually written off as love of the game, and then sort of not moved past because that's, you know, as an idiom, that's a bit of a linguistic dead end. It's sort of an impermeable box, and I think phrasing this in puzzles and novelty renders it more pliable. And now you're looking at the differentiating factors in intrinsic motivation. I love that you said like winning games of Warmachine. Um, you know, and another one is, you know, attaining, say, for instance, the social approval of your peers. Like these'll get you up high fast, but they'll also land you on a plateau forever. You know, because the signal does, like, your reward signal doesn't get an immediate feedback from the game. It gets, you know, feedback from the outcome of the game. And you know, I think in the past people have talked about playing a beautiful game or something like that as a benchmark. Um, is that they but what it's hinting at is you're dealing with this situation in increasingly elegant and clever ways, and win or lose, you can derive pleasure from engaging in it, and re-engaging in play review is a source of further reward, rather than, say, if your motivation is winning the game, you know, losses are psychic damage. And you may have to, through discipline, force yourself through a research process, versus for a puzzle motivated person, you know, diving into it and failing is its own reward, and it's more rewarding to review it and review it and review it and keep iterating.
Yeah, and I think another aspect is that if we think of this like putting a rat in a maze, or two different rats in a maze, and they both want the cheese at the end, obviously. But if you give one rat, or you give both rats the same challenge, and the puzzle, you could wait it out for an extra 10 minutes and then the puzzle gets easier, but that means that there's less cheese left for you. Or you could try to solve it immediately and get there faster. And I think a lot of players see challenges presented by, say, a feat or some combination of abilities that their opponent presents. And they say, or they don't say, but they may subconsciously go through the thought process of, I could try to solve this right now, but it's gonna be hard. And if I wait a turn, it'll be easier. And a lot of players will just wait a turn to their detriment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the players who love solving puzzles and dealing with the novel and the complexity will say, oh boy, this is a fun one. This is a spicy one. And they'll sit down and they may find a solution because they have this intrinsic enjoyment of the process that leads them to engage in it more deeply and more aggressively than somebody who doesn't intrinsically enjoy it. And because of that, they find a path to victory that doesn't exist to the person who does not have that innate love of puzzles. Like
Right.
if you sit down and you see a challenging position with a feat or some combination of models and you say, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this, then you're not going to deal with it. Like you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to solve that. But if you say, wow, this is really cool, it's challenging me and making me think, you might be surprised to find that there is a path forward that your opponent didn't think of when they built the puzzle, or that they did and they were hoping you wouldn't find, and that following that path leads you to a more advantageous board position than you otherwise would have been in.
Or in some circumstances, this is the best I got. I just hope they fail.
Right. And sometimes when you are in those situations, you have to solve the puzzle. And this is another thing that led to my epiphany is I watched players in games where they were presented with a puzzle that they must solve now or lose the game. And I was watching and I saw that there were solutions to the puzzle that the player didn't see. And this happens all the time, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
occurred to me that solving these puzzles is a fundamental skill in Warmachine. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And it's also not a surprise that the more you enjoy an activity, the easier it is to increase your skill at it.
Yeah. I think I'd almost like break this apart from skill, or, while we've, dispensed with essentially inbuilt things like intelligence, that like discussing them is not necessarily useful or productive of further growth. Um, there is a risk of, love of puzzles and this kind of dispositive curiosity coming off as, a sort of inborn personality trait. I'm just gonna old man yells at clouds for a second and say, like, yeah, personality has an extremely strong genetic component, but it's way more malleable than people give credit for. Your personality is a changeable thing. It's highly changeable, and it's deliberately changeable. It is something you can go to work on. But I like hearing you talk about it more. I almost wouldn't describe this as a personality thing or as a skill. Um, skill in the Warmachine context, I'm on record as saying, is training system one. System one adding more to its repertoire is skill. They're literally the same. What this is, I think, is more in the line of a faculty, or a facultative domain. What do I mean by this? Feral children in the woods get found all the time, relatively throughout history, more than you would expect. If they grow up without language past a certain point, it's very difficult for them to add the linguistic faculty to their repertoire, and they never really internalize it all the way down. There are, so that's one example. Like, it needs to be taught at a certain stage, but there are also faculties like, uh, straightforward examples are, music and mathematics. Like language, they are very distinct domains of thought and like cognitive activity that follow their own rules, structures, and axioms. And once you've trained yourself in them, it's not necessarily that you're getting system one good at them. It's that you're characterizing your cognition in a new modality. Um, like you're characterizing cognition in the language of music, in the language of math, in the language of game puzzles. And I think, as as a category versus personality, be it inbuilt or malleable, this is actually a far more tractable territory to come to grips with and unlock for oneself. Like, somebody out there in listener land may not be by nature a puzzle solver now, but if you think about the game and begin to force yourself to engage with puzzles for their own sake, you will develop this faculty.
I think a really simple but compelling example of this is years ago in a different life, before Warmachine, I played a lot of chess. And I didn't have any real kind of formal training in chess, but it's a thing that I picked up and started playing more and more. And so I started reading books on chess. And initially, I didn't really enjoy chess puzzles, which are a thing for anybody who doesn't know in chess. There are, I don't know how many books, probably hundreds, thousands of books, where there are literally pages with a picture of a chess position and it says solve for mate in however many moves. And that's all you do. And I didn't initially enjoy them because I'd look at them like, this is so dense, this is challenging, it's not fun for me. But I wanted to improve at chess. And so I tried to make myself read through these chess puzzles and try to solve them. And obviously, the more I tried to solve chess puzzles, the better I got at solving chess puzzles. And the more I started to enjoy puzzles until I got to a point where I was reading chess puzzles and trying to solve them for fun rather than out of a motivation for improving at chess. And I didn't really think of this um, parallel until we're talking about it right now. But I think that just approaching a puzzle for its own sake and trying to get to the juicy meat inside the nut repeatedly can help you develop an enjoyment of the process if you allow yourself to. And it's the difference between seeing a puzzle and saying, no, no, thank you, or seeing a puzzle and saying, oh my God, I hate this. I guess I'll do it because I have to. And seeing a puzzle and saying, okay, this is an opportunity for me to work on solving a puzzle. Let's have fun with it. And sometimes it's just that deliberate mental switch of saying to yourself, let's do this, and being positive about it and saying this is a good opportunity for me to grow as a player, and who knows, it might even be fun. And if you do that enough times, you develop this faculty for solving puzzles and can actually start to enjoy the process in a way that it motivates you to engage with that process more, and then it just snowballs from there.
Right. That's interestingly, by the way, one of the ways in which you can sort of self-demonstrate that that personality is more malleable than one would think is just start changing your attitude towards specific things and saying, this is a joy rather than this is a burden. It will change how your mind and persona operates very, very quickly. Yeah, there's like, because you're gonna, and I guess this is the important thing for like people who are like, okay, well, so what? You know, you haven't convinced me on, you know, that this is necessarily the secret. Uh, I'm just trying to think through the counter cases and like what could be, you know, said against this thesis. And you know, I think you know, the principal one is a sort of object oriented way of thinking, like, well, some puzzles are unsolvable, but you know, like, you're going to be in the territory of linguistic determinism. If you tell yourself that, it limits the frontiers of what you can do. Versus if you say, I am going to solve this, or I'm going to try to solve this, you know, your mind isn't placing a limiter on itself. And like, you're gonna encounter problems that seem insoluble in Warmachine. And maybe they are. But if you react to them with like that negative brain signal, I can't do this, you are going to be stuck by that problem over and over. So it's like changing how you relate to problems as a positive signal rather than a negative one.
Yeah, I agree. And even not even saying there is a solution here, but saying I'm going to try to find the solution. There may not be one, but if you conclude that before you start, like you said, there won't be one. But it doesn't have to be so extreme as like, I'm going to solve this problem or puzzle. Like there's a solution. You can just say, here's a puzzle. There's probably a solution. I think I can find it in the time that I have. And maybe you will, maybe you won't, but you're going to engage in the process more honestly and enthusiastically if you do it with that mindset. And that's the only way that you're going to grow as a player and like find all of the different lines and tools available to you, is if you have that open, optimistic, enthusiastic approach to it. It's the same as like if your parents ask you to do a chore when you're a kid, or if you ask your kids to do a chore and they don't want to do it, how good a job are they going to do? It's going to be awful, right? Maybe it'll be passable. Maybe it'll get done. It's not going to be the best job. But if you ask somebody to do a thing that they enjoy doing, it's probably going to be the best result that you've ever seen.
Right.
Because somebody gets joy from doing the thing, they're going to do it better than anybody else who doesn't enjoy it. And so I think that their domain of competence will rapidly expand and outpace people who don't love it, even if they're good at it. Exactly. And so I think the key here is, how do we teach ourselves or train or develop or foster ourselves to have this joy, to be able to find this joy in puzzles? That's the challenge, I think, and the goal here.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, because I'm thinking about it. I'm like, it's like struggling to retrieve from a dim past. Well, maybe in some ways a dim past, and in other ways a relatively recent past. You know, because I had been through a period of my life like where even though I didn't have this language around it, that was something I had, taken upon myself as, as a motivation in Warmachine back when I was first trying to break into the tournament circuit, circa like really in earnest around 2014. And, I had in the morning a 30-minute walk to the train, a 30-minute train ride, and then a 10-minute walk to my office. And every day I'd take those 70 minutes and just pass through, because I was playing a ton of games at this time, just pass through in my mind's eye the game I had played yesterday or whatever it was, and like just pop on some music and just really think through it all the way. In addition to keeping playback tapes, this really helped my growth going. And then over the past year, I've been through some very hard personal patches, particularly pertaining to work and some other stuff. And my relationship with the game changed a lot because of how many like outside stressors from work I was under. And I found myself during games, feeling rushed and not taking particular pleasure in them. And this had started to come out in my play and was like a major hindrance for a long time. I'm just trying to think like what exactly I did to break through that. I mean, how would you advise somebody to break through and start to incorporate this?
I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it, and this is a realm where we sort of lean heavily on analogies and metaphor to help us understand and provide a framework for discussing it. And I know you and I have discussed this a bit before this recording or before this stream. And there are sort of two main areas that we talked about, or two main other activities that we talked about as analogies. And chess and cooking, I think, lend themselves
Mm-hmm.
very well to this. So to start with the chess analogy, I think for anybody who has sort of rudimentary understanding of the game, there's the opening, there's the mid game, and the end game. And openings are characterized by a very rote, structured, predetermined series of moves that both players know and engage in to reach a relatively predictable mid game. The end game is characterized, again, by not necessarily a rote and predictable board state, although to an extent, if the game follows without a lot of novelty the typical opening sequence, it will be. But it is very it's simplified, so it's relatively easy to calculate and therefore has a predictable outcome if you understand it. There are few complexities, and it's basically a walk down where both players know what's going to happen. The middle game is where a lot of the novelty and creativity occurs, and that's also what will often determine victory in a game.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah, the messy mid game.
right, the opening is in Warmachine akin to building your list, is akin to choosing your opening. And then sitting down at a table, you know sort of what your opening moves are going to be. You expect your opponent to respond in a certain way. In fact, you hope that they do because that's predictable to you. And then you know that you're going to respond in a certain way to that. And it's real easy
Mm-hmm.
to fall into the habit and pattern as a player of just really crutching and hoping for those predictable openings where you have this list that you built for the meta and your opponent's playing a list that you're meta familiar with as well. And you are hoping that the first two turns of the game go like you expect them to. And then you have less to think about. It's less demand on your problem solving skills and your creativity and ability to deal with the novel. And then you can get to an end game that you're hoping is favorable to you based on the meta list that you both played and the meta openings that you both gone through. So one way to break
Mm-hmm.
out of that is to play non-meta lists, to go out of book is the term in chess, where you engage in an opening that steps away from the established optimal line of play that dozens to hundreds to thousands of chess players have explored over however many months or years and found that these first 17 moves are correct. You step away from that and you build a list that that accomplishes some things that you want to accomplish, and you focus on learning how to play that list. And when you sit down at a table, instead of hoping for your opponent to play the predictable moves and do the predictable things, you're hoping they do something new and different. And sometimes
Mhm.
it's just that approach to the game where you sit down and say, I hope I see something new, rather than saying, I hope this goes the way that I think it will.
Right. It's almost like a bit of a trope. Um, like a character who's excellent at something, like plays some situation or fights some battle, and it goes as predicted, and they win, and at the end they're disappointed. Like, damn, I was hoping for something novel. Um, I think I can provide almost a this is a niche example, but Boggity Bomb versus Old Witch. So you're running King, Scuttlebutt, Vraugr, some Battle Brigs versus a house, pass full of other war beasts, and Dreadrots. Um, After having run this game a lot of times, there is a stock opening. Advantage goes with the second player, and the Brine Blood's job is uh, get the king positioned far forward and orbiting facing Witch and the house. Um, don't get charged by Dreadrots. Make sure Scuttlebutt doesn't get dragged, and that at all times, even through Labyrinth, Scuttlebutt has walk and shoot range to Witch or house. If whichever pops Labyrinth with the king in her control area, she loses. Um, and if you can touch the house, the king can kill it, but you'll typically need warm up damage, and you need the majority of Dreadrots to die on the turn that you go in on the house. So all of this dictates the first 2.5 rounds of this game are going to be maneuvering. You're going to conduct a very particular dance with your pieces, and if this comes off, the rest of the game is okay. My king goes in, most of their Dreadrots disappear, and then I'm just micromanaging threats from Isaiah, the Cage Rager, etc. And we are walking down. I think it's a game where, one, there are few enough pieces, and two, into one another's armies. Like, these are armies that can be quite dynamic, but when they face each other, they're actually relatively static. Um, does become a book exercise to play. And if you screw up on book, that's it. I think that's the case in this matchup, having played it a bunch. uh and who gets punished by not executing the on book is highly variable. It's usually whoever's going first. um but like, most games of Warmachine are not like this. Most games of Warmachine will not boil down to. There will be some elements that are like stock or book, like um, your deployment into fixed formations, so your different modules can configure themselves in particular ways, leverage their synergy, etc. Is in most matchups fairly fixed unless you're disadvantaged. And sort of the scenario and the terrain may change whether favor the Sicilian opening or some other play. But the early game is early game in Warmachine tends to be fairly formulaic. Um, Now the twist is when you're disadvantaged. Like, if we take this whole, I could put out like an if then like worksheet for the Boggity Bomb versus Witch matchup. If you're on the losing end of that if then worksheet, you can't rely on stock openings. You have to change things.
If you
Um,
are, if to brief aside, in chess, if you're playing against an opponent that you know has mastered an opening, you don't want to play the book opening against them. You want to take them out of book. You know that they've played this matchup, Old Witch versus Boggity Bomb, 30 times, and they understand the matchup inside and out. They know what you're going to do. They know how they need to respond, and they know what turn 4 is going to look like if you both stay in book. And you know, as a player who's familiar with it, that if you do that, you're going to find yourself in a disadvantage mid game. So what you have to do if you're going into a game with that understanding is you have to embrace the novel, and you have to leverage your creativity and your ability to manage a dynamic, unpredicted game better than your opponent, and hope that that finds you in a position that is more advantaged after you step outside of book.
There's an interesting thing, because I think while the sort of nub of this is moving from journeyman to master, there's actually an apprentice to journeyman trap that can get set here, because Warmachine has relative ranges, free movement, etc. It's actually kind of hard to write a book of Warmachine exercises. And I think a lot of players who are looking to graduate from apprentice to journeyman often get flummoxed by the early game, because sort of early game is like ticket to admission to where the game gets interesting, but they don't have the proficiency in openings. And early on in a lot of people's careers, they actually tend to overemphasize the importance of threat range because it's what keeps defeating them. That they don't know how to go off book on it, and that's partly because, to a certain extent, they're still like hung up on how do I manage my own mechanical execution. Like, I don't know what to do with my hands, but once I get past that, that's where like all the juicy meat is getting into the messy mid game, and then beyond that, discovering the fairly deterministic but extremely learning rich late game.
Speaking of meaty and rich, I think the cooking analogy comes in handy here, because I think one of the ways that you can assist yourself in fostering this love of the novel and puzzles and expressing your creativity on the table is by learning your ingredients as best you can. And I think what you just mentioned is a lot of players, when they're trying to get from journeyman to, or apprentice, journeyman to apprentice. What is the order? I don't know these.
It's ancient guilds and trades. It goes, you start as an apprentice, you just push the bellows, and then you go to journeyman, like you're making some routine things / like you're building up the skills to have your own shop, and then you graduate to master.
Cool. So from noob to player at a master. So getting from the noob to player stage, one of the things that you need to do is understand your tools or understand your ingredients. And if you don't understand your ingredients, you can follow a recipe all day, but you don't know why you're adding this much of this and that much of that. And so you're going to find yourself in games or situations where you're like, I know that I'm supposed to add 2 tablespoons of mechanithrals. I don't know why, but I know I'm supposed to, so I'm just going to do it. And you fail to recognize the nuance that in this situation, 2 tablespoons is too much and you're going to spoil the dish. So instead of focusing on following the recipes past a certain point, really try to understand the why in the recipes. And this is a thing that you can focus on when you're speaking with whoever your mentors are or people that you chat about with the game, is don't just ask them, should I take this model in this list or that model? Ask them the question, which model do you think is better for this list and why? And you can also ask them, what are some situations where you think the other model might be better? So that you're focusing not just on learning the recipe, but learning about the ingredients. And they might tell you that what mechanithrals add to a list is not just spice, but they also add a textural substrate to help hold the dish together. And if you don't have enough of that, then it's going to fall apart. And then you can start to internalize, very abstract here, right? Analogy, sure. But you can start to internalize, this is why I add mechanithrals to a list. And so that you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to solve for a matchup problem, or you're playing a game and you understand not just that this ingredient is supposed to get added here, but why it does. And you can apply that in a novel situation and obtain a better outcome than you would if you just followed the recipe.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because there's actually an apprentice graduation question to be asking yourself in reviewing your games too, is like, you know, can I explain to my mentors or my opponent when reviewing the game or whatever why I did what I did? Um, and then on the flip side too, like, once you're at master level, like you can start to build like, you can start to build like some Heston Blumenthal style recipes too, where it's like, what if we essentially distilled the essence of olive and then put it into like a light gelatin and then reconstructed the olive from like chemical first ingredients? Like, what if we build a list that doesn't hang together like we expect normal lists to? Um, Even if you follow that recipe as an apprentice, you're probably going to screw it up.
We see this a lot with like cocktails, for instance, where you read a list of ingredients and you may say, I don't understand why this is supposed to be good. But then you drink it and you're like, this is amazing because the person who crafted it understood their ingredients and had vision and creativity and reformulated some things in a way that accomplished something that was unexpected because they took the time to really understand what they were putting into the drink rather than just following convention and recipes. And the same thing with food and cooking, obviously. You have a dish
Yeah.
sometimes, and like, I don't understand how this ingredient goes with this, but they put them together and it's amazing. And that opens your horizons as an eater or an enjoyer of food or cocktails or whatever as well. And it can do the same thing in Warmachine. If you try different ingredients, sometimes you're going to find that they do a thing that you didn't expect. And that's going to broaden
Hmm.
your world and your ability to play and your ability to look at models and evaluate and appreciate them more in the future as well. So sometimes you just have to step outside of convention to try things. And maybe you'll fail a lot and you'll find out these things don't work, but you're going to learn a lot more about why they don't work, which is also going to help you learn about why they do work and be able to use them better in the future as well.
Right. There's a period in culinary history. I think it's around the time of Escoffier, but I could be wrong about this. Where if you got a recipe book, it would often just be like the recipe would just be a list of ingredients. It wouldn't tell you about the preparation. Maybe it would give you some steps on timing, but it sort of just anticipated that you knew what to do with this collection of things and how they were supposed to work in relation to one another. So there's actually a period of culinary history that's weirdly hard to reconstruct. But I feel like we've been sort of living in that period in Warmachine for a long time, like that sort of delineated historical period. Where you'll say a list of models and there's an anticipation that people know how it's meant to work together, but the corresponding knowledge is not necessarily there. Um, like the Boggity Bomb list I run is like to a certain extent a Heston Blumenthal dish. It's very bizarre. It's very high strung. If you read the list of ingredients, it doesn't make sense. Um, so I mean, asking the question of why and being able to answer the question why is very important. There's also a lot of value in just screwing around. I think I've told this story before. When I used to love having new players come to the shop when the Oakland meta had a thriving local game store. Because I learned like it doesn't really behoove me or the new player for me to like hold back or handicap myself. And a lot of people can tell when they're having like a game thrown to them. So there were two things I did. One of which was I reached deep into the jank tank and pulled out the weirdest models that I would probably never pursue competitively, but I'm like, I'm going to handicap myself in this way. And this game is still going to have value for me because I'm vetting this and I'm relying on my background of experience with this game where even if my opponent's not playing particularly well, I can extrapolate forward seeing this model on the table where it might be useful. So I'm getting value out of this game. My opponent is getting a step more of value than they would otherwise by facing a weaker list, which pairs things out. The second thing I would do is crank my verbosity setting to maximum. Like the entire time I'm playing, I have this inner monologue of what my models are doing, and the switch that's flipped is that inner monologue without filters becomes an external monologue. I'm just saying everything I'm thinking about and why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And then my opponent is doing things and I'm saying everything that I'm thinking about why this is good or bad for me. I mean, you got to have somebody that wants that kind of experience and you can peg it back. But, there's a whole process that goes on that can really help people by giving them access to the why. Like, everybody knows that like a mirepoix, like your onions, your celery, and your carrots is the base to a lot of sauces, a lot of stews, etc. Why that is? If you're just starting out cooking, you don't necessarily know. But you work with mirepoix a lot, and eventually you get it. And you can there are things you can do to accelerate the process for yourself and for others. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the fundamental sort of aspect here, twofold, is trying new things for the sake of trying them and asking why. Which is the asking why, I think, is such an easy thing to do that we fail to do so often, whether we're talking to others or whether we're building our own lists. If we're building our own list and we have a model that we're going to put in every single time with this caster, how often do we stop and ask ourselves why? Why do I need this with this caster? We probably did the first time we built it, but have we done it since? And I think it's important to ask why as often as possible, because often the answer changes. And often that leads you to new discoveries for something else that might fit that role better.
Right. I mean, an example, Jeff is swooping into the rescue here. Everybody has their comfort blanket piece that they'll just say yes to in a heartbeat. And it may be a little more expensive, or it may be a support piece like Madame Moriarty, or, name your piece here. And if you ever leave home with your comfort blanket, you feel wrong, but you don't necessarily understand why. And it may be that it's undercutting what you're trying to do. Part of me playing Brian's this year is, especially with as big of a shakeup as there was, I'm trying to like ask why to every comfort blanket I've ever had. There's stepping back for a second, like if we're just gonna like step back a layer and say, you play game of Warmachine. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. It's very easy to separate that and say, oh, it's the matchup, or oh, it's X and Y and Z. But as soon as you turn complex processes like a game into a concrete thing with defined qualities, you lose tractability. Like it loses tractability for you. Your ability to manipulate, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, actually takes a big hit.
Hell yeah, Jeff.
Hell yeah. There's asking questions about why did I win this game, why did I lose this game, and getting really relentlessly curious rather than like, I think of the opposite of curiosity as reification. Reification, relatively modern term, Latin root word of republic, the public thing. Reification is thingification, turning something from a complex process into a discrete thing. Once something is reified, it's so hard to get to grips with. And it's just an action of your mind of how it relates to a complex process. If you reify something, you're actually closing the growth frontier there.
It's the same as dogma, right? Why is this
Right.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
belief?
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
correct, right? Like it's dogmatic approach as opposed to an inquisitive approach
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
analytical approach.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I think so. One example of asking why and never stopping to ask why for me is in Gravediggers. For a long time, I tried out the heavy field gun and I was always dissatisfied with it. It never performed how I would have needed it to for me to fit it into a list. And I kept trying it in a bunch of different contexts because I'm curious and I want to try things and learn about them before I just dismiss them. But it was not the sauce. Every time some new release would come out or some new problem would present itself, I would reconsider all of my tools, all of my ingredients and ask myself, is this ingredient going to make this recipe sing now that, the temperature is different or the humidity is different, or now that I don't have this particular source of butter that I need, can I fix it with this? So like I'm always going back and looking at the same tools. And when Bandit released, I asked why again with the heavy field gun. And one of the things I had learned from my previous experience with trying to find out why this model does or doesn't work is that your application methods for flare were very either ephemeral or limited and unreliable in Gravediggers. So you've got heavy machine guns, which are very good at applying flare most of the time unless boosting is required. But when you apply one, it's probably going to die the following turn. And if you're trying
Hmm.
to position them to apply, it might die before you even get to apply the flare. And so that's a big limitation, especially when your opponent knows that killing this heavy machine gun doesn't just remove the heavy machine gun from the table, which they're already incentivized to do, but it's one step closer to making your 7-point heavy field gun a paperweight, which is even better for them. So one of the main drawbacks of the field gun is that the application methods were not reliable enough for me. And there were also things they couldn't break through, like if you're dealing with higher defense, even if you can give the field gun fire for effect, your heavy machine guns might not be able to hit. Or if your opponent has shield guards, a bunch of shield
Right.
guards, or even a few shield guards, it's very difficult to get the application to stick because you only apply flare on the first shot of a heavy machine gun. Or if you're paying the points for a Patriot with a tracer cannon, only that first gunshot applies it. So your application is also very limited in that regard. So when Bandit released, and he had the ability to give flare to every one of his gunshots plus every jack in his squadron, I looked again to the field gun and said, or asked myself the question, why would the field gun not be good now that I have more reliable, more
Right.
numerous, more durable sources of flare? And the
Right.
answer that I
You have a
found,
durable applicator and 5+ attempts.
thousandth time, now that something was different again, was a highly effective list that I can now play because I asked the question again, right? Because I didn't stop
Hmm.
asking the question.
You know, I'm I'm also, if I'm reaching for my own example, I'm also reaching for uh it was, this set me down like, sort of most of my adventure this year. Was at Rocky Mountain Rumble, as you, me, and a couple other guys sitting around a hotel, hotel bar table waiting for our order and talking about how do we solve this gun line problem, like who has the power to get through it, back in like February. um
I wasn't trying to
and
solve
I
it. I was trying to be the problem for the record.
Oh, you were, but I'm just sitting there like, well, what if we go boggity bomb? Because they have X and Y and Z fundamental limitation. Like, what if I just lean on these limitations a little bit? And I remember you saying like, that's never gonna work.
I told you were crazy.
Um,
Which, to be
yeah,
clear,
yeah.
you are. You are crazy.
I
And
don't deny
sometimes
it.
crazy works.
But yeah, yeah, there's answers to it, but like what was occurring to me there was the why, and up until what point does this hold true? And those points at the time being every gun line in the game, their math starts to get dodgy at arm 20 with close to 60 boxes. Blessing of the Gods is a limited applicator. Their math starts to get really dodgy to the point of impossibility at armor 22. And they typically can't respond, like don't respond well to threat range in excess of 13 inches. So if you can push all these things at once, you can say it's going to take you more than one turn of shooting at me to get me, and I'm fast enough that you only have one turn. And that came out of asking why, out of, or rather a more specific question, like under what circumstances do they stop being able to shoot you to death? Or how many times can they do that again? This is, by the way, one of the great, like, when it comes to attrition strategy, I think one of the marks that separates a journeyman from a master is willingness to be patient with an attrition plan. Because you'll run down the math and say, oh, okay, I can't kill this thing in one turn. And a lot of people won't be willing to try. But a lot of Colossals, like, for example, in their efficacy for, like, bullying the board and trading, drops off if they take 20 plus damage. Doesn't matter if you don't kill them. If you don't lose much in the process of dealing 20 plus damage to them, they're in a ton of trouble. They can't sustain aggressive positions without engagement anymore unless you dump a ton of resources in recovering those boxes. So, like, there's a lot of people, once they're proficient in the game, focus on answering problems all at once, but you can answer them over time. And that's something that you only get to by asking a lot of questions about your experience. I mean, honestly, you probably come to it faster by having it happen to you. Once again, just being really curious about your own thought process, and like, you don't want to do it in the moment, but after the fact, relentlessly second guessing your decisions.
It's always good to debrief a game, even if it's just with yourself. But ideally, if it's with someone else, like a friend who was at the event, or another Warmachine friend that you can have these debrief, good conversations with, and talk about your game, talk about decisions that you made and the outcomes that happened, and try to understand why those outcomes occurred, and try to explore other possible lines of play in those games and how they might have changed the outcome. And Ward Table is really good for this because you can save a sandbox in its state before you make a bunch of branching decisions, and then later you can go back into that sandbox and say, at this pivotal point in the game, if instead of doing this, what else could I have done? Because I know that what I did led to victory or defeat, but what if I had done something different? Would that have led to a different outcome? And it's through that analysis, that debriefing that we call it, where you can learn a lot about not just what your list or the pieces in your list are capable of, but what your opponent's list is capable of, and how seemingly innocuous or seemingly bad decisions or moves could lead to more favorable game states for you. And you're not gonna get that in the game most of the time because it seems correct, and you're usually gonna follow that. But when you go through a game and, like you say, you see it on the table and you learn, like, oh, apparently me taking all this damage in my Colossal, even though it didn't get one rounded, is still bad. So I needed to make a different decision before that happened to avoid that. What could I do? And then maybe you find that, keeping your Colossal completely out of the game, even though it seems like a terrible decision, ends up being the correct choice for that matchup in that game. Or maybe diving your Colossal for a trade down ends up being correct because of how it sets up the scenario and the rest of the piece trades for the rest of the game. And so that curiosity into how could I have done things differently? How could my opponent have done things differently to defeat whatever I did? That's what's going to lead you to these discoveries and a deeper understanding of the game and your pieces. And that deeper understanding is going to lead to you having an easier time and a more enjoyable time in trying to engage in the novel and build
Yeah.
or craft these new recipes or these new lists or games that are transformative beyond what is the established meta for that caster or faction or whatever.
I had a game against our friend Mr. Matman X Michael last night. He's running Galena with a Gorger, so 16-inch threat Gorger. It's got the big club. I'm trying out Old Witch, and I'm just looking at the board. He goes first, runs his Gorger with Rush a bazillion inches forward. And I'm looking at my deployment. I'm like, maybe I just feed him the house. Like, just put it in a position where he needs to do X and Y and Z to get to it, and just give it to him. And we played out the game, and then he and I are just sitting there talking through every detail we can think of with the game, and I'm like, what if I just run the house straight at you, like put you inside the charge range of the house? Like, how does that go? Like, that might go better even. Which is totally against orthodoxy for, essentially a lot of Grimkin armies suffer from being 5 model armies, like 5 high consequence activations surrounded by a bunch of junk. Like, what? What do you mean? I send 20% of my substantial activations straight downfield to be killed?
So I know that you are new to Grimkin, and this is the perfect kind of mental activity to be engaging in when you're trying to learn a faction. Is ask yourself, why don't I just do this? Or why is it important for me not to do this? And one thing that I have observed from watching other players learn Grimkin and develop a lot of epiphanies and deeper understandings of the faction is that quite often giving away the house is the proper trade, because your opponent must deal with it, and you have the tools to kill whatever they send in afterwards, and you can find yourself in a cascading advantageous position if you offer a 0 gain trade. And by 0 gain, I mean you give them the house before the house ever deals any damage, right? Sometimes that's correct.
This is how I used to run the blockader with Gaston. Is like, in half of all matchups, like, the blockader's job is just to draw other models to it and put it into the kill zone. Or in half the games, its job is to go and die somewhere in order to, like, reserve a chair for Gaston to put his butt down and say, like, now I'm going to shoot you.
Yeah, or like Decathus with a Hellraker, another modern example.
Right. Yeah. You just need a big dumb body to get in the way. And if you get obsessed with, I paid 26 points for this, you're not going to be in the most productive spot.
Which is
I have to run to the restroom real bad, so I'll be listening along, but I will be off camera and muted for a minute.
Sure. Yeah, so I think this is one of those things where the dogma that we take into the game of Warmachine, that we pick up from the game, where your colossal is an important piece, you need to protect it and get value out of it, is a thing that we, even though that makes sense in so many situations, we still have to question why. When we sit down in a particular matchup or we build a new list, we have to ask ourselves, is that still the case here? And why is that the case? And if not, what other options do I have for how I use this? Jay Beatnik says we're taking over the stream. If there was a way for me to plug you in and get you to take Alex's spot, I'd do it, but you'd have to wear an Alex mustache and put on, I don't know, an Alex cowboy hat or something. Pretend to be the Cosmo. But yeah, so this willingness to continue to question what you know to be true, so to speak, I think is an important aspect in allowing yourself to grow and develop as a player, and basically keeping yourself inquisitive, curious, and open to creativity. And I think learning how to play Grimkin and asking yourself, what if I just gave you the house right now, is a good example of that. Or for me, if I'm building a new list in Gravediggers, like I've got this McCoy list that I built, and I already talked about how Bandit opened up the field gun. So this list started off, I had like 7 units of infantry in it. And the idea was I'm going to charge a bunch of infantry at my opponent. And what I kept doing with the list is asking myself, do I need unit number 7? Why do I need it? Let me try the list without it. Do I need unit number 6? Why do I need it? Let me try the list with only 5. And I got to a point where I am now where I have 4 units in the list. I've got 2 units of commandos, a unit of rangers, and the rowdies. And that is enough with what else I have going on, because I was willing to continue to question my choices and question whether what I established to be true in my mind was still true. And I think you have to be willing to change. I think you have to be willing to be wrong in order to embrace this curiosity and this creativity that's going to take you to that next level of understanding and performing in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because everybody writes golden rules for themselves, like creates their own internal dogma, or sometimes has it created by the metagame at large and the wisdom of the community as a whole. And it's you are more likely to discover gold by consistently questioning dogma than you are trying to invent something out in the wilderness. And this definition of discovering gold, by the way, does include reinforcing that the dogma is correct. Because if you receive metagame dogma, like your list needs to look like this, it needs to include X and Y and Z, this model entry is bad. It's dogma for a reason. More often than not, the collective wisdom of the community is correct. And what you get by questioning dogma is that deep layered understanding of why. Because it goes from just what you're told about it to an internalized understanding. Like you see the pieces of the puzzle and under what conditions this fails, even if it's most of them, and under what conditions it succeeds, even if it's very rare some. And sometimes you discover that the dogma can, have an exception or caveat inserted into it, or you can change, how this particular piece operates altogether. But you only really get there by testing the limits. And once again, reinforcing dogma can be a win in Curiosity, and you should regard it as such. It's another one of those motivations that actually can subtly cause you to plateau. My motivation is to win games of Warmachine, or my motivation is to be, approved of by my peers. My motivation is to discover new things or have my self-expression validated by my particular new innovation, is actually that will actually cause you to plateau really badly, versus just being curious about the game and wanting to solve puzzles for their own sake. And wanting to solve puzzles for their own sake, in the long run, will actually get you to be doing creative new things far more quickly.
I think a very simple and linear example of this also is cheating on a test.
Yeah. You have a test
who
do you
up.
Cheat? Ostensibly the test, but
yeah, it's a math test, and you're like, I know that so and so took this test last year, and this teacher hasn't changed it because they're an idiot. So I'm just going to get the answers from them. And you go and you take the test, and you've got the answers written down, and you're like, oh wow, it's the same questions. You're writing the answers. You're like, I got it, I win. And then you move on in your next class. You have another test. You still haven't learned the math because you haven't asked why and tried to understand. And this teacher, you're like, oh, I'm going to get the answers from so-and-so for their test. But this teacher's not an idiot, and they have changed the test. And now you're going to fail because you don't understand why. And I think it travels perfectly to Warmachine, where we ask our friends for lists. And a major difference I noticed between the players who are bound for greatness or are already great, and players who are still learning how to how to take those next steps are the great players, or the ones who are bound to be great, ask you, what is the list for this caster? Tell me what the list is. And you give them the list and they say, great. Can you tell me why for each of these things? And they ask you questions and they try to understand and they say, great, thanks. And they go down and they sit down to play that caster, and they have changed some of the things you specifically told them to do. That you specifically told them, you cannot play without this. They've changed those things. And you may think, why are you doing that? Do you not trust me? Do you not understand? Are you an idiot? And that's not the case. They sit down, they play it, they learn about it on the table, and they come back to you and they say, thank you for giving me that list. I tried it with these things and I tried it without some of these things. And I found that I really needed these things for these reasons. And thank you for sharing that with me. And you may learn from them something about why those things are in the list that you didn't expect to learn. You may learn that those things aren't as essential as you thought they were. But those players who are bound for greatness are already great, are not just asking what the answers are. They're asking why those are the answers. And then they're taking the time to play with the pieces and understand why those are the answers and whether the answer could be better or different, or whether there's a different way to arrive at the same thing. I think like a good example of this is you tell a player in your Kithgard list, take a unit of Spirit Shamans. And they say, okay, thank you. And they go and they play a bunch of games without Spirit Shamans. And in 9 out of 10 games, everything goes fine. But in the 10th game, they lose without any chance of winning because they didn't have Spirit Shamans. And they say, okay, I understand what they said, and I saw it on the table, and this makes sense to me now. And so when they're building lists in the future, they're going to have an understanding of why Spirit Shamans are in there. And it might not just be because of magical weapons, right? It might be that the mage static is clutch. It might be that having a unit that can be concealed and or prowled is clutch. But they'll understand why those pieces need to be there, and that'll help them identify when they don't need to be there and help them take that next step. And so it's being curious, being willing to test the dogma, and being willing to be wrong as well.
You know, there's I'm gonna use this as a segue because I want to dive back into on book and off book play. But once again, this is something I've seen Cody DeMund do that is a clear dividing line between the good and the great. Cody is down to play anything. You can put, despite his claims to fame as, the master infernalist, you can put pretty much anything in front of Cody, and he doesn't necessarily even need to change the list. He can be playing carbon copies, and I've watched him sit down and play carbon copies and innovate in front of the person who gave him the originals. Because he's sort of playing the whole thing and like really doing that thoughtful, like, okay, what is the dual use here? How do I reconfigure the modules? Throwback to the many modules discussion. He is doing that process of asking you, okay, I see you've given me the list. Why this? Why this? Why this? Why this? And then like at the end, okay, I agree. Now let's reconfigure these things. This is also one of the challenges of reification is I feel like often people look at a unit or model entry and get a particular use case in their head, like straightforward one. Spirit Shamans are the magic weapon guys because the faction doesn't have magic weapons. And you'll watch a lot of games where 4% of your opponent's army is just dorking around in the back line, maybe scores an objective, but actually magic weapons doesn't matter that much. The reality is like Spirit Shamans are, one of the archetypes of the most multi-use models in existence. Like they can create water, they can get concealment, they can prowl. They have random magic attacks that may, like in corner cases, completely turn off your opponent's piece's ability to play. They have POW 14 blessed magical weapons that are only handicapped by low accuracy. Like, if you get this concept locked into your head that like these guys, what is my purpose? You fetch the butter. Like, your pieces aren't going to work that great. But But if you're going why, and then also importantly, and what else, you can achieve a lot of things very, very quickly. So like, I would say, in this carbon copy situation, or even in the like design independently situation, Cody's somebody who I've observed has like geared his mentality to be able to move from good to great very quickly in any situation. And this is all down to his inner game.
It's
How
the
how
it's the
he
curiosity and the creativity.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think this, this pivots back into on book and off book. Because in order to innovate, you need to understand the orthodoxy first. If you don't understand the orthodoxy, you're not innovating. You're typically just flailing.
You're guessing.
So yeah. So when we talk about on book, it's very easy to ascribe this a pejorative aspect, but it's actually not. Stock plays and stock openings and stock use cases exist for a reason. It's usually because they're found to be effective in some way. Um, so like the virtues of playing on book is, like you said, you're not guessing. um, One of the big ones is it starts to remove inconsistencies if you just execute on the known plays. Like it, like having a well internalized Warmachine exercise prevents you from making trivial error. Further, there are things that are like representatives of on book play, because I think we have a tendency in this game to over talk about lists and sort of under talk about other aspects. I think this is also one of the things that like gatekeeps the good out of the great is list fixation. Like examples of on book play being highly productive and providing consistency include, you and I have talked about it obliquely, but having a turnover turn questionnaire and ask, like, you'll always ask yourself, what do I need to score on each turn? And then what can I score? And then, like, for me, playing like a weird Blumenthal list where I need to leverage every activation to the hilt and I'm looking for every extra inch of leverage, I'm asking myself at the start of every turn, what extra leverage do I get from command cards? Partially because a lot of people treat them like max potions in some RPG where they're saving their command cards for the final boss and they'll win or lose without having used any of their max potions. You know, these can provide real leverage, and you're not going to find it if you're not asking. Um, and that's an example of being on book. Uh, you know, um, Another one is like on book does feed system one to a certain extent. Like I I don't regard ability to execute mechanically as deeply important to this game. It's almost more like a bit of a cake baking competition, or sorry, a cake baking skill check. So concept from the Street Fighter player slash game designer David Serlin. Um, when evaluating the value of certain mechanics, or doing certain things, is it a real skill or is it a cake baking test where, like, if you're playing a game of Street Fighter and you want to execute like your combo, if you stop and then from scratch bake an entire cake and then it's rated by judges, and if it's good enough, your combo deals 25% more damage. You don't want mechanics that are cake baking competitions. And I think some things like mechanical execution ought to be regarded not as a skill that you're graded on, but more like an entry fee. And on book helps with, cake baking mechanical execution.
I think it's important when we're talking about learning what the book is for an opening, translated into Warmachine, learning the fundamentals of a list build and how to play in certain matchups. It's important to understand why that is the book, because if anybody who's played chess has had the experience where they're playing an opening and they understand it, and all of a sudden their opponent goes way off book. And you look and you're like, I know that's wrong. That's a blunder, but I don't know why. And I'm going to lose now because I don't have enough time to figure out in the game why that's a blunder and how to punish them for it. So like when I play Blitz chess, I love the King's Gambit. I love that opening. It is a solved opening in the sense that it is incorrect and leads to a disadvantaged game for white every time if black plays it correctly. But it's an unpopular opening as a result. It's very dynamic and very open, and black usually doesn't play it correctly.
Yeah, because they've run into it one or two times, like, you know, when they're first getting coaching, but not really ever since then.
Right. So it's like the Warmachine equivalent of, why did they just run their Colossal at me full tilt and let me try to kill it bottom of one? That feels like that's a blunder, but am I missing something? Am I able to exploit this? Do I understand why it's a blunder? And if you don't spend the time being curious and investigating why the established wisdom is what it is, then you're going to find yourself in games where your opponent diverts from that and you don't know how to punish them for it because you don't understand why that is the book for the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit like a subspecies of donkey space, you know, where you start throwing suboptimal plays, but it turns out the only way to play in suboptimal plays sometimes is other suboptimal plays. And so you find yourself in this whole bizarre territory that is like, this is not optimal, but playing optimal is not going to win me this game. There's a lot of other traps along the same lines, like, you know, when people talk about efficiency in Warmachine, they're usually talking about their own psychological blockers and hang-ups, wanting to play with their toys in the particular way that they feel like they have fun. Inefficient solutions are often effective. You know, brute forcing is a byword for unsophisticated techniques that work in many fields for a reason. You know, great example, and like, this is just a list building, like, model composition and design thing, but a lot of people think of the Abyssal King as a gun platform. It's one of the worst gun platform colossals that's ever been printed. It sucks as a gun platform. It is wildly inefficient, and it only works because it can put so many resources downrange. Is it a great use of its time in like an objective efficiency sense? No, almost never. Does it work? Plenty. You know, so people have, like, you know, sort of standards or ideals for how they think their toys are supposed to play that can also be hindering. Like, it's an internal self-imposed dogma that, you know, can get you stuck. Off book play. You know, you've sort of alluded to it, but something like, you know, we generally speak of it, well, because it is the domain of creativity and particular expression once you've reached the master's game. It is worth noting, it is not always effective. A lot of off-book play sucks. And you know, the real, like we're pushing the curiosity question into heightened importance because you have to be able to move through the permutations and the novel game states and answer satisfactorily, is this going to be effective, yes or no? But I think one of the things here, and sort of where we get into a weird space when talking about list building and model entries is a very, like, tractable way of talking about the game, because you have to deal with the least abstractions and you have to reach for sort of the least, you know, you don't have to reach for or coin new terms to explain what you're talking about. But I would almost say, if you're playing off book effectively, you're not playing with pieces, you're playing with the shape of the game. Like, all the time people will talk to me about tech and sort of my eyes glaze over, or like the specific effects that models have, or like certain things. There was and is a point in the game where, I just stop seeing individual models. I just see heavy, like real heavy. I see business unit. I see, like mixed support unit, and sort of the specifics of it drop out. And what's important is there are four heavies on the board. That's one less than they need to, to be able to play a peace trade on X vector. So I don't care whether they're, malefactors or strikers or primevals. I'm going to play this game plan because you're counting the shape of the game overall is you're counting on your heavies to operate in a particular way, and you're just going to pull up short on that resource. So you're interested much more in how all the elements come together than whether you need a tablespoon or a half tablespoon of paprika. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think this manifests a lot when people are evaluating a list or a matchup, and they might say something like, "Oh, well, I have Invictus, and I know this particular list will often bring Iris, so as long as I have one shield guard, I'm okay, and I don't need to worry about Iris shutting down Invictus. I'm in an advantaged position." Whereas the reality is that on the table, there's a lot more going on than just Iris, Invictus, and the shield guard. And you have to understand the influences on that matchup and be able to play a holistic game with what you have. And if you play that game, you're like, oh, one shield guard isn't enough because they have this other knockdown gun. So I need two shield guards. You fall
Right.
into a trap of trying to solve your problem by adding ingredients, and you just wind up with a stew that is too salty and flavorless. Whereas the reality is you needed to use your ingredients differently or do something different in the cooking process to get the outcome that you needed. So you need to, I think it's easy to myopically focus on the individual pieces in a game as opposed to how those pieces all work together in a scenario on a table in a match.
Right. And often the pieces that in most situations for an army list are going to be your game winners are going to be dead useless in others. Um, it's a writing advice, kill your darlings. Um, you're gonna have darlings in your list. You're gonna have things that you get precious about, and you just need to not be wedded to that. God, I wish I'd thought of this while outlining, because this is totally a component, but it's like maybe I just run my house at him. Maybe I just let him, eat the house or try to eat the house. Like, it's usually it's 20% of your substantive activations. It's usually gonna be your game winner. Um, but you have to not be wedded to that being the only way to play. Um, and and part of why I think people can get like, like, well, one more shield guard will fix it, I swear this time. Is they're too wedded to a particular picture of how things have to be with this army. This is something every time I've discussed the module topic, I try to emphasize is modules are not about reifying a particular use case and telling you, you need this kind of module, and they always act in this way. It's know the role of each piece you have and how they can be recombined. Because what we're actually interested is defining, the roles and being able to identify them in service of being able to recombine and to play different.
And part of this whole conversation is how do we foster a love of puzzles in ourselves as a player, and then how do we use that to get to the next step in terms of our ability to excel at the game because of that. And I think this situation of, say, Invictus and Iris and a shield guard is a good example. If
Mhm.
you see this problem on the table, you're like, oh, I played Invictus into Iris and she disrupted Invictus and then he was out of the game for a turn and it sucked. I'm going to go back and I'm going to address this problem by adding an ingredient, by putting a shield guard in. You're not confronting the puzzle head on. You're just trying to change your list to not be presented with that puzzle in the first place. This is avoidance.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not engaging.
that's a
And
good way to put it.
if instead you engage with the puzzle and you say, okay, let me play this again. I want to engage with this puzzle again and see if I can do something different to find a path forward. And maybe you find that you can present Invictus to your opponent in a threatening way where they have to deal with him, get Iris to come forward and shoot Invictus, but be prepared to deal with Iris on the following turn so that you can have Invictus after that. Then you've engaged in the puzzle solving process. You've grown as a player. You found a solution to the problem that didn't involve just avoiding it. And that's going to carry over into the future. For one, you're going to get this positive feedback where you find yourself realizing I tried to solve the puzzle and I got a good result. And that releases whatever chemicals in my brain that feel good. And that was pleasant. I enjoyed that. And then the next time you're going to sit down in a game and you find a new puzzle that's novel to you, you don't have the opportunity in that game to avoid it and say, oh, well, I'll just change my list next time to not have to deal with this puzzle. That doesn't help you win that game. So you need to foster and develop this puzzle problem and puzzle solving skill set or faculty to win in games where you don't have the opportunity to avoid the puzzle. And going back and trying it again with a positive attitude about it is a good way, I think, to develop that faculty and foster that enjoyment. And I know I do it, and a lot of players that I know do it. You play a game in like a tournament, and you're like, well, that was something new. I hadn't fought that before, and it was very challenging. Cosma, can you play this for me? I want to try it again with the same list and see if I can play it differently and find a way to break through. It's that curiosity and that willingness and desire to engage with that same puzzle again until you find a solution. That's what I think really builds this ability, this faculty to engage in the process when it matters in a tournament game.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And it's like the difference is there, like, you take a beat in a big tournament, maybe that you care a lot about the results of, like, you encounter a novel situation, your opponent does something creative or that you've never seen before, and you try to engage with it and you don't get it right and you get spanked. The difference is, do you say, I hope I never have to deal with that again? Or there's a great XKCD comic about this. Do you say to yourself, I wonder if that happens every time? Damn you, Google. It's not bringing it up for me. Yeah, because, like, if something spanks you like that, like, this isn't going to be the last time you're going to see it. If your reaction to it is adverse, you're not only not setting yourself up by saying, I hope I never see that again. Like, you lost this game and saying, I hope I never see that again, and that being the end of it, is actually going to make every subsequent time worse for you. Versus, who do I know that can play this into me so I can try this? Even if they execute it imperfectly, like, let's do this a bunch.
Yeah, Jay Beatnick's comment, I think, is actually really appropriate here, because if you are trying to find a solution to the puzzle and you're struggling, another great tool is to rope in other people who you know are good puzzle solvers and either have them help you work through the problem or give them your list and you play the problem list and say, please find a way to work through this and beat this. And they may think of something that you didn't, and you'll see their approach. And maybe it doesn't work, but that gives you an idea for something else to try that you hadn't thought of either. And that's how you get to the solution. And the whole time you're doing this, it's collaborative, and it's you and a friend, a trusted friend, working together to try to solve that problem. And you will find that that's a very enjoyable process. When I'm sitting down with you to, like, find an answer or a solution to a game, that is really a matchup that's very challenging for either me or for you, it's way more enjoyable for the two of us to be working through that than to be doing it live in a tournament game with somebody else,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And that collaborative, enjoyable aspect is going to increase your affinity for engaging with the puzzles in the first place and for engaging these aspects of your brain where you're trying to work these problems as opposed to avoiding them. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish here, is build this willingness to engage with the puzzles and try to foster this enjoyment of the process. And I think that having a collaborative, supportive friend or group of friends that you can do that with is a really good way to build that in yourself.
Hmm. I'm gonna digress a little bit, just to say, if you ever get the opportunity to be a WTC alternate, jump at it, like absolutely jump at it, because I gotta say, what Team One in particular has been doing with David Kwan, I think is like, a model for all future years and for player growth in general. Because David has been around in this game for a long time, and I would say in his time in Mark III, he was one of those guys who made the leap from good to great. Not just that he was achieving results, but that he had cultivated the kind of mindset that it took to get there and sustain it. Left the game for a long time, came back very, very recently, um, and is demonstrating that he's still having it. But, Team One had structured this collaborative goal around the alternate that it's like, okay, if nobody breaks a limb in Poland, we're all playing in the team tournament and you're playing in solo masters. But you're gonna play 10 games with each of our armies bare minimum and be absolutely proficient and fluent in them, and you're going to be absolutely proficient and fluent in this other thing that you're going to be playing in solo masters. And it's like force injecting someone into the process that's going to return maximum growth rewards, and being around them as like guaranteed sources of authority and advice, to help them steer through, navigating the orthodoxy and the dogma and really discovering it for themselves, so that, if the worst happens, they're prepared to pick up the mantle, you know. And it's every team is a little bit different, but I see what Team One did this year, and I'm like, God damn, that should be a model for everyone. You know what I mean?
So I will say
Um,
that I think David is special in the sense that he already, before joining the team as an alternate, has this innate curiosity. Was he born with it? I don't know. I wasn't there when he was a kid, but he has it now. But you too can be special in the sense that you can embrace the mindset of being curious. And in
mhm.
fact, I don't know if you've watched the show Ted Lasso, but one of my favorite quotes from that show is in the first season, early on when he's playing darts, and he is sort of sandbagging this guy who's an asshole in the show, and then he just starts destroying him and hitting bullseye after bullseye. And he's going through this monologue as he does it, talking about how when he was a kid, I think it was his dad taught him to be curious rather than be judgmental. And when somebody does something, instead of judging them, ask why, ask how. And I think that applies to Warmachine. That's what David does. He steps into a new faction and says, now it's my time to play with Shadowflame. So instead of looking at the list and saying, these are the lists that my team has given to me, these are the good lists. I judge these good lists. I see other lists. Those aren't those lists. Those are bad lists. He doesn't do that. He doesn't judge them based on the dogma that he's received. He asks why. He asks,
Mhm.
why is this thing in this list? How do you play this? Why do you do it that way? And then he goes and sits down at a table and he's curious and he learns about it. And I've watched him go through multiple armies now. And some of them he picks up very quickly. And some of them are more challenging and he gets dumpstered for his first few games. But instead of getting irritated and saying, wow, they gave me bad lists, these lists aren't good, he asks, comes back and asks, "This happened to me. Why do you think that happened? And what can I do differently? Or what would you have done in that situation?" And through that process, he gets to a point of proficiency with the list that would astound certain people if they realize how quickly he got there. And it's because of that curiosity and going back to others and engaging that collaborative process with not just us as teammates, but other players in general.
Hmm.
And never being afraid to ask why and never stopping to ask why. And he clearly relishes the process of learning these new things and solving some of the same puzzles, right? With different tool sets each time. Because like you're running into the same meta lists when you're switching between Grimkin and Shadowflame Shard and Dark Operations. And each time you have to do it with a new tool set. A lot of players are going to find that very frustrating where they're like, I already figured out a way to beat this with Grimkin. Why am I trying to beat it with Dark Ops now? This is frustrating, right? But David really enjoys trying the same puzzle again. Like he's the guy who will play New Game Plus in a video game with a different class each time to beat the bosses, right? And find a new way to beat them
Hmm.
each time. And he enjoys that process. And I think that's a thing we should all try to enjoy is
Right.
learning how to beat the same boss with a different class because it makes you a
Yeah.
better player.
So yeah, yeah, that's absolutely correct. And there's oh gosh, sometimes when Serlin has, we didn't discuss it much, but versus being puzzles, Serlin characterizes games as debates rather than puzzles. But you will every now and again you'll be talking about Warmachine and how to solve a problem, and I think like one of the indicators, just like one of the greatest growth points you can have in experimentation, is realizing that the orthodoxy is correct. um when you're talking with David about like tech or a strategic situation, um he will debate you to the hilt, but sometimes he'll just hit a point where he's like, you've made the argument, and he goes, "Oh no, yeah, you're correct," and there stops being an argument. Because not because his arguments were weak, but because and not because like you're particularly strong or whatever, but because he's turned it over in his mind and is always wants to be on the side of what worked. And like, okay, the position I thought I was on doesn't actually work. I don't have any enduring emotional commitments to it. I'm just going to move on to what worked, and it's a new glorious plateau that's in front of me by having argued this all the way to the hilt and discovered I was wrong. Um, I practice game we played a while back, because you were asking me for Brian's games. I was playing Thorga and complaining vociferously about it the entire time. Every turn, God, I effing hate this. Um, I had real concerns about Thorga Boomhowler's viability, particularly her low agency game plan. Got to talk with Andy some at Adepticon about what he does to mitigate this. It was interesting. I was still protesting vociferously the entire time, but Scuttlebutt releases, we run the checksum again. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm down with this. all in on Thorga. you know, um, like
I
a
think,
willingness to move, and a willingness to move because what matters is like actually exploring and being interested in the results of why, more than your particular why being right, is important. And I mean, in some ways, like, this is all a methodology, like very loosely put in changing domains a bit, but like this is sort of a methodology for how to wake up from being an NPC and be a PC.
yeah, I think an important aspect of what you were just saying is that it is very easy to accept a conclusion being argued to you when you have the mentality of being new to that army or to that activity. So in the case, for instance, that we were talking about of David going to a new army and saying, explain to me why this is supposed to work this way, and arguing about it, and then reaching a point where he's like, all right, you've convinced me. Like, we don't need to talk about it more. I get it. Thank you for explaining, right? It's easy to do when you didn't go into it with a pre-established opinion and some
Mhm.
concept that you already know what it's supposed to be. It's more difficult for a player who's been playing an army for a long time, who has their own dogma that they've established or has been established for them, to discuss a particular point with someone else, have that person make a very compelling argument backed by experiences that they've had, and it's more difficult to accept that, even though that may be something that you should be accepting. And so I
Mhm.
think it's an important skill, and we've heard this in other contexts in life, to always try to have the mentality of a beginner, where you're always learning and you can always be wrong. And if you go into your list building and your approach to games with that mentality, that here's what I think, but I always have more to learn and I could be wrong, then you'll find that it's a lot easier to be wrong, and that being wrong is
Right.
often very good for you because you grow
Right.
from it.
Right. This is the reason you mount vociferous defenses of positions. Is it's not to be right, because actually, what do you gain by being right? Merely in words, virtually nothing. You're actually looking like the healthy attitude is to go into every discussion, and even I think like this is sort of uh, a sort of dark mirror to the curiosity and love of puzzles thing. You go into every game desperate to be proved wrong, and you can only be proved wrong by mounting the most vociferous defense possible and admitting when it doesn't work.
Yeah, it would be
Like,
miserable to be One Punch Man
yeah,
in
yeah,
Warmachine, right?
absolutely, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like this goes back to very early in the discussion. Like, you have to have your struck, like, in order to grow conducively at all, you have to have your mental reward system set up to reward failure states. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. Like, you have to structure yourself to derive real positive value from failure states. And in a debate, that can involve being wrong. Like, we had one of these the other day where it was like you, me, David, and Rick talking about a particular matchup. And I was particularly insistent going after one angle of this matchup, like, well, what if you do this? And Rick had an angle that he was like very insistent on, like, this is the problem, this is the problem. And we're going back and forth, and he says, like, okay, look, secondary line of argumentation, how many times can you do that and it succeed? And I just think through it and go, oh no, you're right. This is a disaster. The important question is not does it work, it's how many times can you make it work.
Yeah. And I think it's just, as a human being, it can be difficult, especially for a lot of people who aren't used to arguing or debating as a normal part of their lives, to engage in that process. It can feel uh, like there's a lack of trust in their skill or their understanding of the game if you ask them a lot of really piercing questions and argue about their proposition. And I
Mm-hmm.
struggle with this sometimes with people, because when I am analyzing something new or analyzing a matchup, I don't just take what my opponent or what my friends or somebody's telling me at face value. And this goes
Right.
back to what we were talking about, where like I want to understand the why. I put it through
Yeah,
the
you can't
paces,
you
and
can't take it at face value, otherwise you lose out on so much gold.
right. So a lot of the conversations I have will seem like I'm uh like engaging in this adversarial argumentative process, because I am. I'm testing the proposition so that I can try to understand how far it goes, where it stops holding, and to what extent it's going to be relevant in a given game, or like game by game situation. And sometimes I engage in this process and I'm like, okay, yeah, you've convinced me. That is 100% I agree. Sometimes we go through the process and we'll learn together, like, well, here's a limitation that neither of us had thought about before. And it's only through like rigorously examining dogma that somebody else has developed for good reason that we can grow it. And I think the analogy of on book, off book, what the book is for a chess opening is the same. It's the same exact situation, right? Like somebody comes up with an opening and they're like, here's moves 1 through 3. And here's how people are supposed to respond. And then someone else comes in and says, but what if I respond this way? And they'll be like, no, 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 that's wrong. And like, all right, well, let's spend some time exploring that wrong position. And then the book changes and you see that this variation is actually optimal rather than what the original opening was, right? And so you go through
Right.
this iterative process many, many times with many people involved playing and challenging the dogma until you arrive at a position like the King's opening or like, okay, it's wrong, right?
Right.
But that's a long process with people not just taking your word for it and challenging you and trying to find a reason why you're incorrect. And I think that as groups of players, we can make ourselves collectively better by being willing to engage in that challenging
Right.
process of taking dogma, really examining it, testing it
Mm-hmm.
out on the table and seeing if it's correct. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it is with a caveat, with an asterisk that we learn more about in these different situations. It's not correct, but most of the time it is. And sometimes it's just wrong. And we've all been doing it for a certain way for months and it's just wrong.
Yeah.
And like, if we do it differently, this is just better, but nobody realized that because we didn't think of it because the other way was
Right.
working, right?
I can do you a condensed version here, which is you will never, to the extent that a matchup is bad, you will never win it if you play strictly on book. You will have no idea of which matchups are good and bad to the extent that you haven't read the book or written it. And it's typically faster to read a book than it is to write one. But you have to be proactively engaged with it.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis.
Oh man! All right, so we're closing in on time, but this is I think this is a thesis statement, which is a profound articulation. We've gotten very philosophical and gone all over the map, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you: is there any points on this topic you would die if you weren't able to get out?
I think we have discussed it pretty thoroughly at this point. It's a topic that even just sitting down and discussing it with you, I've thought of more aspects and elements and
Yeah,
developed it
me too.
more. But I think the fundamental takeaway that I want players to have is to be curious, to enjoy the process of solving new problems, and to ask questions to understand not just what, but why. Always be
Mhm.
curious, try to understand the why, and enjoy solving puzzles. When you sit down at a game, tell yourself, I'm going to enjoy a novel situation. I hope they show me something new because I want to try to figure that out with the tools that I have. And when you are playing a game and you hit a wall and some really difficult challenge, don't immediately think to yourself, after this game, I'm going to change my list. Don't do that. Think to
Do
yourself,
not.
after this game, I'm going to go to X player because I know they play this faction really well, and I'm going to ask them to play it against me again. And together, we're going to enjoy solving this problem. And I'm smiling because I know that the next time I face this player or somebody else at a tournament, I'm going to kick their ass because I figured it out, right?
Yeah. It was it's a constantly repeated Cosmos story, but one of the best games, like one of the most rewarding games I ever had of Warmachine was I traveled for a big convention overseas. I'm playing Rasheth Changang into Doomshaper Runes of War, and my opponent's like, "Oh, I've played this once or twice." And like I think he goes first. He moves his situation forward. I unpack and do like openings I've discovered. He's like, holy crap, you executed your turn perfectly. I'm like, yeah, I've played this matchup over 200 times. I know it's 55-45 you me, and I only win by being better than you at this specific game.
I live in the margins, and I'm gonna be in those margins, so I hope you can too.
Yeah. Oh man. All right. Anything else for everyone out in audience land, Brandon? Sounds like Jeff at least is pulling a lot from this one.
Stay curious, my friends.
All right. And with that, we're out for this week. Keith, take us